The year is 1956. Chrysler would make an all-new V8 engine family. This engine family was originally for Plymouth exclusively until after 1958. Then Chrysler would make it available on some Dodge models as well. The Chrysler A, often referred to as the Plymouth A, was a polyspheric head engine, like the polyhead engines, but Chrysler would never use poly to name the Chrysler A. It was never called Poly. The Chrysler A engine block was based off of the Hemi engine block used in the early 50s, but with an expanded bore centerline spacing of 4.46 inches. It also had a taller deck height of 9.6 inches, so it could grow. It's worth mentioning that both the Hemi and the Poly had valley covers, whereas the A series opted for a larger intake manifold to cover the space, saving money. The crankshaft was enlarged and strengthened for long-term durability. 5 main bearings on the crankshaft. The combustion chamber kept its rounded poly design, but changes were made. They would use different spark plugs, resistor-style spark plugs, and they were moved closer to the center of the combustion chamber. Valves were also enlarged for better breathing. Most engines in this family used mechanical valve tappets. This engine used overhead valve or valve in head, and they were actuated by push rods, 2 valves per cylinder, 1 intake, 1 exhaust. Introduced in 1955 for the 1956 model year, 277 cubic inch displacement, overhead valve V8 4.5 liters. It's good for anywhere between 180 to 200 horsepower at 4,400 RPM, up to 272 pound-feet or 369 newton meters around 2,400 RPM with a bore of 3.75 inches and a stroke of 3.125 inches. Compression is 8-to-1, 5 main bearings. Years this engine was used was between 1956 through 1957. It could be found in the Plymouth Plaza, Belvedere, Savoy, as well as wagons. It was also found in the Facial Vega. In 1956, Plymouth would increase bore and stroke, bringing bore up to 3.8 inches and stroke up to 3.31 inches, which brought overall displacement to 302.5 cubic inch displacement, oftentimes just referred to as 303 cubic inch displacement, overhead valve V8 5 liters. It was good for 240 horsepower, 4,800 RPM, 310 pound-feet or 420 newton meters at 2,800 RPM with a bore of 3.8 inches and a stroke of 3.31 inches. Compression is 925-to-1 with 5 main bearings. Years this engine was used was 1956, and it could be found in the Plymouth Fury. In 1957, Plymouth would increase bore to 3.9 inches, bringing displacement to 299.6, oftentimes just referred to simply as the 301 cubic inch displacement overhead valve. V8 4.9 liters. It's good for anywhere between 215 to 235 horsepower at 4,400 RPM. Up to 305 pound-feet or 414 newton meters at 2,400 RPM with a bore of 3.91 inches and a stroke of 3.125 inches. Compression was 8.5-to-1 with 5 main bearings. In 1957, Plymouth would increase displacement by increasing the bore size to 3.875 inches, but they kept the same stroke at 3.125 inches. Used in the 277, this engine was an export engine mostly. 313 cubic inch displacement, overhead valve V8 5.1 liters. It's good for anywhere between 170 to 205 horsepower, 4,400 RPM, up to 305 pound-feet or 413 newton meters around 2,400 RPM with a bore of 3.875 inches and a stroke of 3.125 inches. Years this engine was on offer was between 1957 through 1967 in the Canadian market, Australian market. It was also found in Bristol from 1961 through 1963 and 1963 to 1965 Bristol Mark I. 1957, the most common version from this engine family would be released. It's important to note that this engine is different than the later 318LA. Very confusing, right? Chrysler had a knack for using the same engine displacements across many different engine families. 318 cubic inch displacement overhead valve V8 5.2 liters. It was good for anywhere between 230, 260, all the way up to 290 horsepower at 4,400 RPM, 330 pound-feet, or 447 newton meters at 2,400 RPM with a bore of 3.9 inches and a stroke of 3.31 inches. Compression was 925 to 1. 5 main bearings. Years this engine was used was 1957 through 1966, and it could be found in a lot of different cars, whether that be in Plymouth, Dodge, or Dodge trucks. In 1959, Dodge would borrow a 318 and bore it out to 3.95 inches, bringing displacement to 325.5 inches, but not to get confused with the Red Ram, which also went by 325 cubic inches. They just called this the 326 cubic inch displacement V8 5.3 liters. It was good for 255 horsepower, 4,400 RPM, 350 pound-feet, or 474 newton meters around 2,400 RPM with a bore of 3.95 inches and a stroke of 3.31 inches. Years this engine was used was 1959, 1 year only, and it could be found in the Dodge Coronet. In 1964, Chrysler would introduce an all-new engine family to replace the Chrysler A, aka Plymouth A engine, with the LA. But as they say, that's another engine episode for another day. All right, now it's time for Would You Rather. 2 scenarios today. In the very first scenario, would you rather have a 1959 Dodge Coronet or 1956 Plymouth Fury or 1960 Plymouth Savoy? I'm going to leave this here for a minute. If you need more time, feel free, pause the video. On to the second scenario. 1956 Plymouth Wagon or 1958 Plymouth Wagon or 1962 Plymouth Wagon. Once again, I'm going to leave this here for a minute. If you need more time, feel free, pause the video. All right, now it's time for Name That Tune. First person to get both the name of the band and the song title correctly in the comment section will have their comment pinned to the top of it. If you have any cool stories to share about a time that you had in a Chrysler A or Plymouth A engine, please feel free to share it in the comment section below. Thank you all so much for coming out and watching this. If you'd like to get in touch with me, shoot me a comment in the comment section below, or you can always send me an email at what_it's_like@a-lost-and-mostly-forgotten-web-provider, yahoo.com if interested. Thanks again for everything, and until next time, toodaloo!